The story begins with a young man, barely in his 20s, struggling through the hardships of life. Born into poverty, most of his youth was spent trying to survive rather than dream. His parents had passed away when he was still a child, leaving him to fend for himself with no stable job, no proper education, and no one to turn to for help. Each day, he lived in the hope that fate would eventually be kind to him. Despite his struggles, he always held on to his dignity. He took on any job he could find, often toiling under the scorching sun just to earn a few pennies. Some nights, he went to bed hungry, other times, he had to swallow his pride and beg for work. His life was an endless cycle of disappointment, and the weight of his misery grew heavier with each passing day. In contrast, there was an old woman who, at least on the surface, had everything. She was wealthy, powerful, and known throughout the town for her sharp business mind. Yet despite her riches, she lived alone in a grand but empty mansion. Over the years, she had seen many people come and go, but no one people respected the old woman, but no one had ever truly loved her. She had spent her entire life accumulating wealth, only to realize that money could never ease the loneliness that haunted her. One day, fate led the young man and the old woman to cross paths in the most unexpected way. Exhausted after another long day of job hunting, he sat by the roadside and happened to overhear a conversation between two men. They spoke about a strange rumor that the old woman was searching for a husband. The unusual news immediately caught his attention. According to them, she was willing to offer a staggering sum of money to any man who agreed to marry her. Some laughed at the absurdity of it, while others shuddered at the thought. But the young man sat in silence, his mind racing. Could this be the escape he had been hoping for? Could this be the answer to the prayers he had whispered on cold, hungry nights? It was a deal that went against everything he believed in, yet he couldn't ignore the opportunity. He wasn't the only one struggling. His younger siblings needed care, his debts were overwhelming, and his future seemed hopeless. The thought of marrying a woman old enough to be his grandmother made his stomach churn, but the alternative, a lifetime of poverty, seemed far worse. As if fate had already made the decision for him, he hesitated only briefly. That very evening, he stood before the iron gates of the grand mansion, his hands trembling. The sheer magnificence of the estate only emphasized the vast gulf between their worlds. As the gates slowly creaked open, he stepped inside, knowing that his life was about to change forever. Whether for better or worse, he couldn't say. But one thing was certain, this decision would haunt him for the rest of his days. For as long as he could remember, his life had been filled with hardship. Born into poverty, he had grown up in a crumbling house with his younger siblings. His parents had died when he was still a teenager, leaving him with the crushing responsibility of providing for his family. There was no time for dreams, no space for hope, only survival. Each day, he woke up before sunrise, wandering the town in search of work, knocking on doors, visiting every shop, desperately hoping for a chance. Ad ever stayed. Each day, he wandered through markets and waited outside construction sites, hoping someone would need an extra pair of hands. On good days, he managed to find a few hours of work, carrying bricks, unloading goods, or cleaning the shops of wealthy merchants. But the pay was meager, barely enough to afford a meal. On days when no work was available, he returned home with empty pockets, his stomach twisting in hunger. Hunger was his constant companion. Many nights, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind consumed with one thought: how would he feed his siblings the next day? His younger brother and sister were still too small to understand the full weight of their hardship, but they felt it nonetheless. They had learned not to ask for things other children had: no toys, no sweets, not even a warm meal. Instead, they accepted their reality with quiet resignation, their eyes filled with a fragile innocence that he feared would soon fade. Despite everything, he dared to dream. He dreamed of a better life, of breaking free from the chains of poverty that had bound him since birth. He longed for stability, for a home that didn't leak when it rained, for a day when he wouldn't have to wonder where the next meal would come from. More than anything, he wanted to give his siblings a future where they wouldn't have to suffer as he did. But dreams, he had learned, were a luxury for the rich. For people like him, survival was the only goal. The world, however, was not kind to the poor. People looked past him, treating him as if he were invisible, or worse, as if he were a stain on society. Shopkeepers shooed him away when he lingered too long, fearing he might steal. Wealthy families dismissed him with a wave of the hand, as if his mere presence was an inconvenience. Even those who pitied him did nothing to help. They simply sighed, muttered about how unfair life was, and walked away, leaving him exactly where he had always been. There were moments when the weight of despair became unbearable, when he wondered if life was even worth living. He had no education, no skills beyond manual labor, and no connections to pull him out of his misery. It felt as though he were trapped in an endless cycle: work, hunger, exhaustion, repeat. No matter how hard he tried, he could never break free. With each passing day, his desperation deepened. He saw no escape, no path leading to a better future. That was until he overheard a conversation, one that changed everything. A wealthy old woman was searching for a husband, offering a life of luxury in exchange for marriage. The idea was absurd, even humiliating. But for the first time in his life, he saw a chance, an escape from the suffering that had defined his existence. It was a choice no young man should ever have to make. For most, it would have been an impossible choice, but for him, it was the only option he had. The boy had never imagined his life would take such a drastic turn. He had spent his days drowning in poverty, convinced that his fate was sealed. Yet fate, as it turned out, had a peculiar sense of humor. One evening, as he wandered the streets searching for work, he overheard a conversation between two merchants outside a tea stall. They were laughing, discussing a rumor that had spread through town: an old woman, a wealthy widow, was searching for a husband. The mere thought of it made some chuckle and others shudder with discomfort. She was old enough to be a grandmother, yet she had openly declared her desire to marry a young man. At first, he paid no mind to the gossip, but the words lingered in his thoughts. Could it be true? And if it was, why would a woman of such wealth seek a husband now? The idea was unsettling. Yet, deep in his mind, a small voice whispered something he didn't want to acknowledge: this could be his way out. The next day, curiosity got the best of him. He found himself standing outside the grand iron gates of her mansion, a place so far removed from his own world that it felt like stepping onto another planet. He had no plan, no idea what he would say if someone questioned his presence. But before he could turn away, the gates creaked open. A servant appeared, his face unreadable. "She has been expecting you," the man said simply. The boy's heart pounded. Expecting him? How could she have known he would come? Without another word, he was led inside. The house was enormous, its vast halls adorned with luxurious furniture and golden chandeliers that cast eerie shadows against the dimly lit walls. The air smelled of wealth, yet beneath the opulence, there was an unmistakable emptiness. Finally, he was brought to a room where she sat, poised, regal, her eyes sharp as they studied him. She took in his thin frame, his ragged clothes, his uncertainty. Then, in a calm but commanding voice, she spoke. "I want you to marry me." His breath caught in his throat. He must have misheard her. "I will give you wealth, a home, a future," she continued. "In return, you will be my husband." Disbelief flooded his mind. This had to be a joke, a cruel trick. But the way she looked at him, expectant and calculating, told him she was entirely serious. He wanted to refuse. Every fiber of his being screamed that this was wrong, unnatural. No young man should have to make such a decision. And yet, as the weight of his struggles bore down on him, the temptation was undeniable. It wasn't just about him anymore. His siblings were starving. His future was bleak. He had no real options left. Still, the thought of saying yes sent a shiver down his spine. The days leading up to the wedding felt like a slow, agonizing march toward something inevitable. He had agreed, not out of love, not even out of duty, but because life had given him no choice. His hands had been tied by poverty, his dreams crushed by reality. This marriage was not a union of hearts but a transaction, an escape from the suffering that had defined his existence. Yet, even knowing that, he couldn't shake the overwhelming dread that clung to him. His heart felt heavy. His mind clouded with doubt. Was he making a mistake? Would he regret this for the rest of his life? Every time he tried to push those thoughts away, the image of his hungry siblings flashed in his mind, reminding him why he was doing this. When he told his family, their reactions were mixed. His younger siblings, too innocent to grasp the gravity of his decision, simply asked if it meant they would have food every day. His distant relatives, uncles and aunts who had never once offered help, suddenly found their voices. Some scolded him for agreeing to something so unnatural. Others, more pragmatic, told him he was lucky to have found a way out. "At least you won't starve," one of them shrugged. "Better to be the husband of an old woman than a slave to hunger." No one asked how he felt. No one wondered if he was happy. His life had never been his own to control, and this was just another chapter written by forces beyond his grasp. The wedding day arrived faster than he expected, bringing with it an overwhelming sense of finality. The ceremony was grand, as one would expect from a woman of immense wealth. The halls were draped in gold, tables lined with lavish feasts. Guests arrived in their finest clothes, their expressions unreadable. Some had come out of curiosity, others out of obligation. But beneath the polite smiles and whispered congratulations, he could feel it, an unspoken truth that no whispers filled the room, hidden behind polite smiles and murmured congratulations. Judgment simmered beneath every glance. How much did she pay him? Poor boy, he must be miserable. He's just after her money. Disgusting. He kept his head down, fists clenched at his sides. If only they knew the truth, if only they understood that this wasn't about greed but survival. But they didn't care about his reasons. To them, he was nothing more than a gold digger, a disgrace. Standing beside his bride, his hands trembled. In contrast, the old woman was calm, her face unreadable. There was no hesitation in her eyes, only certainty. She had gotten what she wanted, and unlike him, she had no doubts. When the priest asked if he took her as his wife, the words felt like lead in his throat. His lips, heavy as stone, refused to move. But he forced the answer out because there was no turning back now. "I do." No one noticed the single tear that slipped down his cheek. The ceremony ended, the vows spoken, the guests gone. Yet as he stood in the grand bedroom, surrounded by wealth he had never known, it felt as though his life was beginning to unravel. The silence in the room was suffocating, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. His new wife sat at the edge of the bed, watching him with unreadable eyes. There was no nervousness in her gaze, no warmth, just expectation. She had gotten what she wanted. Now, it was time for him to fulfill his role. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the buttons of his wedding attire, uncertain of what to do or say. He had imagined this night in many ways, fear, disgust, even shame, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer awkwardness of it. The thought of being with someone so much older, someone he had no feelings for, made his stomach churn. But he knew what was expected of him. He took a hesitant step forward. His feet felt like stone. The closer he got to her, the louder his heart pounded, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Sensing his hesitation, the old woman finally spoke. "You don't have to pretend." Her voice was calm but firm. His eyes snapped to hers, confusion flickering across his face. She sighed, standing up and moving past him toward the window. "Do you really think I married you for passion?" she asked, almost amused. "I married you because I was tired of being alone. That's all." He hadn't expected this. He had assumed, like in any marriage, there were certain duties he would have to fulfill, duties he had dreaded all evening. But her words stopped him in his tracks. "You can sleep wherever you want," she continued. "This house is big enough. Just remember why you're here. I gave you an escape from your suffering. In return, I expect loyalty, not love." The tension in the room shifted. He had braced himself for humiliation, for a night he would have to endure. But this was something else entirely. For the first time since the wedding, he exhaled. The weight in his chest eased, just a little. And he dared to acknowledge. He wasn't sure if this arrangement made things better or worse, but one thing was certain: his marriage was not what he had feared. It was something else entirely, something he had yet to understand. Days passed, and slowly, he adjusted to his new life. What had once felt like a prison began to feel less like confinement and more like an unfamiliar world he was forced to navigate. The old woman remained distant, but not unkind. She never demanded affection, never forced him to play the role of a devoted husband. Instead, she treated him with a strange balance of authority and indifference, as if he were both her possession and her responsibility. One evening, as they sat in the grand dining hall, the silence between them felt heavier than usual. He had learned not to ask questions, but that night, she was the one to speak first. "You must be wondering why I married you," she said, her voice steady. He looked up from his untouched plate, unsure how to respond. Of course, he had wondered, every single day. She exhaled slowly, her fingers tapping against the edge of her glass. "I never wanted love," she admitted. "I never even wanted marriage. But I needed something." He frowned. "What do you mean?" She looked at him then, her sharp eyes softening in a way he had never seen before. "I have no heir. No family. When I die, everything I've built, my wealth, my home, will be left to strangers. I couldn't let that happen." Her words settled over him like a weight. He had assumed she had married him out of loneliness, perhaps for companionship in her old age. But this was something else. "So you married me," he said slowly, piecing it together, "to make me your heir?" She gave a small nod. "I needed someone who would take care of what I leave behind. Someone who understands struggle. Someone who would not take my wealth for granted." Shock coursed through him. He had spent his life being invisible to the rich, discarded like he was nothing. Yet here she was, telling him that she had chosen him, not as a husband, but as a successor. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or burdened. The idea of inheriting her wealth should have made him happy, but instead, it made him uneasy. He had never wanted riches, only freedom from suffering. And yet, something in her voice made him see her differently. She wasn't just an old woman clinging to her fortune. She was someone who had built everything from nothing, someone who had fought battles he knew nothing about. In her own way, she had suffered too. For the first time, he saw her not as a stranger, not as a burden, but as a person, with a past as lonely and painful as his own. And for the first time, he realized that this marriage was not just a prison for him. It was a transaction for her, a desperate attempt to ensure she would not be forgotten. In the days that followed, something unexpected happened. The awkwardness between them did not disappear entirely, but it softened. The boy had expected to live in silent resentment, trapped in a marriage he had never wanted. But the old woman surprised him. She did not act like a demanding wife or a controlling master. Instead, she treated him with an odd sense of fairness. She never forced him to behave like a husband, nor did she demand affection. What she did do, however, was make sure he was comfortable, that he ate well, that his siblings, whom she had allowed to stay in the mansion, were cared for. For the first time in his life, he did not have to worry about survival. At first, he mistook her kindness for guilt, as if she were trying to compensate for forcing him into marriage. But over time, he realized that this was simply who she was. Beneath her stern, composed exterior was a woman who understood pain, who had learned to protect herself by shutting the world out. One evening, he found her in the library, sitting by the fire with a book in her hands. She glanced at him, then gestured toward the chair across from her. Without thinking, he sat down. "You don't talk much," she observed. He hesitated, then shrugged. "I never had much reason to." She chuckled, a low, knowing sound. "Neither did I." A comfortable silence settled between them. For the first time, he did not feel like he was sitting across from a stranger. The more time he spent with her, the more he began to notice things he hadn't before. The quiet dignity with which she carried herself. The way she treated the servants with respect. The way her sharp gaze softened ever so slightly when she watched his younger siblings play in the garden. She was not the cold, calculating woman he had once thought her to be. Slowly, his resentment began to fade. In its place, something unfamiliar took root. Respect. He still did not love her, not in the way a young man should love his wife. But he no longer hated the life he had been forced into. She had given him something no one else ever had. An uncertain future, dignity, security, perhaps that was what she had truly given him. One day, as they passed each other in the hallway, she paused, studying him carefully. "Are you happy?" she asked, her voice unreadable. He didn't know how to answer. Happiness was something he had never truly experienced, something he had never dared to hope for. But as he met her gaze, he realized that, for the first time in his life, he was no longer afraid of what tomorrow might bring. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough. Yet, the whispers never stopped. No matter how much time passed, society refused to accept their marriage. Whenever he stepped beyond the walls of the mansion, he felt their stares, some filled with curiosity, others with disdain. Look at him. He sold himself for wealth. He must be counting the days until she dies. She's a fool if she thinks money can buy love. The words cut deep, even when he pretended not to care. He had never been respected when he was poor, but at least back then, he had been invisible. Now, he was a spectacle, a young man married to an old woman, a scandal whispered behind cupped hands and laughter. His family, the same people who had once watched him suffer without offering help, were no different. Some distanced themselves, ashamed of his choices. Others suddenly treated him with forced kindness, hoping to benefit from his new life. "You live in a mansion now," an uncle had sneered once. "Don't forget where you came from." As if he ever could. His so-called friends were worse. The ones who had once shared his struggles now looked at him with suspicion or envy. Some accused him of betrayal, as if choosing survival over suffering was a crime. Others only sought him out when they needed something, their words dripping with false admiration. "You're lucky," they would say, their smiles insincere. "I wish an old rich woman would save me too." But none of them saw the nights he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, questioning if he had done the right thing. None of them understood the weight of his choices. And then, there was the battle within himself. Should he stay? Should he leave? There were moments, fleeting but real, when he considered walking away. He had enough money now. He could start over somewhere else, build a life on his own terms. But every time he thought about leaving, he saw her, the old woman who had given him more than just wealth. She had given him respect, stability, a chance to be something more than just a poor boy struggling to survive. She had never forced him to love her, never tried to chain him with guilt or expectation. And yet, the thought of leaving her felt wrong. One evening, as they sat in the garden, he finally voiced the question that had haunted him. "Do you regret marrying me?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked up at the sky, as if searching for an answer among the stars. "No," she said at last. "Do you?" He opened his mouth, but no words came. Because, for the first time, he didn't know the answer. Underscore 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 underscore. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, she called him to her study. She sat behind her massive wooden desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her expression unreadable. "I have something for you," she said, sliding a sealed envelope across the desk. He hesitated before picking it up. The weight of the paper felt heavier than it should have. Looking at her for an explanation, he was met only with a knowing smile. "Open it." With careful fingers, he broke the seal and pulled out a set of documents. His eyes scanned the words, then his breath caught in his throat. The deed to the mansion. The transfer of ownership for her businesses. A bank account in his name. Everything she owned. Everything she had built. It was all his. His head snapped up in shock. "What is this?" "My final gift to you," she said simply. "It's time." Confusion and disbelief swirled inside him. "Why would you do this?" She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Because I never needed a husband, boy. I needed someone I could trust. Someone who would take care of everything when I'm gone." A lump formed in his throat. "Are you dying?" A small smile played on her lips. "Not today," she said lightly. "But I won't live forever. And I wanted to make sure you had a future before it was too late." His fingers tightened around the documents. A future. Something he had never dared to dream of before meeting her. But was this a blessing or a mistake? For so long, he had seen her as a stranger, a burden he was forced to carry. He had resented the marriage, hated the whispers, wished for freedom. But now, as he looked at the woman who had given him everything, he realized something that shook him to his core. She had saved him. Not just from poverty, but from himself. From a life of hopelessness. From a world that had never cared whether he lived or died. And now, she was giving him a choice he had never had before, to stay or to walk away. His fingers trembled as he set the documents back on the desk. He took a deep breath and met her gaze. This time, not with fear. Not with doubt. But with something new. Respect. Gratitude. And maybe, just maybe, love. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. The old woman smiled. A real smile, one that reached her eyes. "Good," she whispered. "Then it was all worth it." Underscore 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 underscore. Years passed. The boy, now a man, often reflected on the journey that had brought him here. What had once felt like a cruel twist of fate had instead become the turning point of his life. He had entered this marriage in tears, believing he was sacrificing his future for survival. But in the end, he had gained more than he had ever imagined. The old woman had given him more than wealth. She had given him purpose. She had taught him strength, patience, and the value of wisdom. Where others had seen an unfair bargain, he had found a mentor, a protector. And in a way, a kind of love he had never known before. Though their relationship had never been one of passion, it had been built on something deeper, mutual respect, trust, and an unspoken understanding. When she passed away, the house felt emptier than ever. The world whispered once more, spinning stories about the young man who inherited a fortune from the woman he had once been forced to marry. But this time, he didn't care. Because he knew the truth. She had not just given him her wealth. She had given him a future. And now, it was his responsibility to honor the life she had built. Standing before her grave, he whispered the words he had never said to her in life. "Thank you." And as he walked away, he realized. It had never been a curse. It had been the greatest blessing of his life.